Okay, everyone, welcome to part one of 5 millennia of Jewish history in 5 weeks. And I want to start off right away with the idea of a 6,000-year world. Of course, we know as Jews, the first principle of Judaism is the idea that the world had a beginning. It's the first word of the Torah. It's the central idea, that there's a creator that started it all. But we also believe that the world has an end. There is a final endpoint to the world. And in fact, there's been this tradition that the world is comprised, the world's going to consist of 6,000 years. That's an idea that perhaps we've heard of. Now, that idea is found in the Talmud. I want to read to you this idea because this is going to be a little bit of a framework for our discussion. The Talmud says in the book of Sanhedrin, I'll read it to you. They taught in the academy of Elijah, 6,000 years is the world, 2,000 years chaos, 2,000 years Torah, and 2,000 years Messiah. So we have a world broken up into 3 sections, one of chaos, one of Torah, and lastly, one of Mashiach, of Messiah. I want to try to explain this idea and see how it all fits in to the grand vision of Jewish history. So the story, of course, begins with Adam. Adam, of course, is the central figure of the beginning of Genesis. And we're told some very strange things about Adam in the Talmud. I'm going to give you guys 2 things the Talmud tells us about Adam, and we'll see if we could deconstruct it and see what it means. So Talmud number 1 tells us that when Adam was created, Adam, of course, wasn't born, he was created circumcised. However, says the Talmud, he decided to reverse his circumcision, to undo it. He created for himself a artificial foreskin. Now, of course, this is a very bizarre idea. We'll try to understand what this means. So, to understand this, we have to look a little bit deeper. What happened to Adam? How was he built? And what's the development stages of the progress of how he became who he was? We're taught in Jewish sources that when Adam was initially created, he did not have an evil inclination. He did not have a Yetzer Hara within him. All he had, the only dominant force that he had that was compelling him to behave, to motivate him, was a force for good. It was his soul. That was the only force that he had within him. Now, the Almighty made a test for him. The Almighty made a test where he told him, here's a tree of knowledge, good and evil. If you choose to eat from the tree of knowledge, good and evil, you will know good and evil. What does it mean to know good and evil? What it means is that from then on, from the point in time in history where Adam chose to consume from the fruit of the tree of knowledge, he knew good and evil. That means that good and evil were both internal forces within him. He integrated into himself a Yetzer Hara, what's called an evil inclination. That's an internal force that's trying to compel him and propel him to sin. Previously, the only force that he had that counteracted his soul, his purity, his greatness, his connection to God was the serpent. The serpent is something external to him. He consumes from the tree of knowledge, and now, from then on, he has a Yetzer Hara, and therefore he knows good and evil from within. From within, he feels a drive to good and evil as well. Now, the Talmud tells us that one of the nicknames that the Yetzer Hara has is Arel, which means it's a foreskin. So what this actually means is when we're told that Adam was created circumcised and then he chose voluntarily to undo that, what that actually means is that he was born with a perfect soul, with nothing inhibiting his soul. He was perfect. He didn't have a Yetzer Hara. He didn't have this proverbial foreskin. And he chose voluntarily to put on himself a foreskin, to eat from the tree of knowledge, and to become someone who knows both good and bad. And this decision kicked off our world. We talk about the first 2,000 years as chaos. Right? There's disillusion. There's obscurity. There's lack of clarity during the first 2,000 years. That is a product of Adam choosing to have both good and evil resonate from within. Previously, God was beknownst to all. All he had was a soul. He had nothing obscuring God from within. He chooses to integrate both good and evil within him. He has the Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara is actually described in the Talmud as a foreign god within a person. And suddenly the God that he was connected to prior via his soul is supplanted by a foreign God, and thus the real God gets obscured. And our history, our 6,000 years history, begins with 2,000 years of chaos. 2,000 years where God is forgotten. God is unknown in the world. Perhaps we can say that metaphorically speaking, the crown of God is obscured by the foreskin of the Yetzer Hara. Now this world, the world where God is unknown, the world where the handiwork of the creator of the world is not readily known to all, that is what we call a broken world. The world is fundamentally flawed. And the term that we're familiar with, tikkun olam, to fix the world, that refers to a world where God is not known, and our job as a nation is to fix it, right? To fix the world that was broken. What Adam did by eating from the fruit of the tree of knowledge, good and bad, of integrating this field that obscured God from his purview, that is what our nation's responsibility or our nation's commitment and destiny is to remove, thus to fix by undoing what Adam brought into the world. Now, the process of, so that's the era of chaos. What's Torah? The era of Torah is an idea where there's a nation, the Jewish nation, of course, we know it post facto, the Jewish nation that their entire mission and purpose and destiny is to bring God into the world and thereby to bring clarity to the world and to start fixing what Adam broke. The idea of Messiah, the idea of Mashiach, the last era, is where it's not just a single nation united under this belief in God, having the clarity of God readily apparent to the people of that nation. Rather, it's the universality of that principle, where everyone in the world and every person, every being attests that the Almighty is a dominant King of Kings and the total power over all. When we talk about the era of Messiah, the end of the last 2,000 years, we're talking about the idea where the knowledge of God that was previously known to Adam got disrupted, 2,000 years of chaos. Suddenly, hope emerges with 2,000 years of Torah, and it's completed with, at the end of the 2,000 years of Messiah, where that knowledge is restored to all. So that's where we start really the story of the Jewish people. The story of the Jewish people begins with the emergence of Abraham. The world, right, thanks to Adam and his descendants, the world devolved into darkness and chaos. And in the year 1948 from Adam, easy to remember, a beacon of light emerged to change everything. Right? In the year 1948, Abraham was born in Mesopotamia in a place called Ur-Kasdim. He is called Abraham Ha'ivri, right, which means from the other side, because he came from the other side of the Euphrates River. Alternatively, Abraham is called Abraham Ha'ivri from the other side because he introduced ideas to the world that were so radical they were like from the other side of the train tracks, so to speak, proverbially. Right? He is the one, right, who had tremendous qualities, and he is going to be the innovator that's going to usher in the next era of humanity. Right? Whereas we've suffered through 2,000 years of chaos, comes along Abraham, and he's going to kickstart the next phase of human history, and as a byproduct of that, of course, Jewish history as well. Now, Abraham, as a very young child, displays tremendous character. Right? He's a pondering young boy, he's very curious, but also he has a very brilliant and innovative mind. And of course, critically, Abraham was an independent thinker. Abraham was a dissenter. He was almost an iconoclast. He was someone who pursued truth, even when that truth was against the conventional wisdom of the time, and even if that would get him into trouble. And Abraham, on his own, with his own faculties, with his own capabilities, with his own intellect, Abraham recognized God amid the darkness. Abraham pursuing truth with his intellect and his ceaseless pondering of the question of the universe, where did it all come from, what's this all about, what's the purpose of the world. In a sea of paganism, in a sea of obscurity, in the middle of the night, a candle is lit. He rediscovers God. He starts the process of removing that proverbial foreskin that Abraham schlepped upon the collective conscience of humanity. Abraham begins the process of dousing the effect of his Yetzer Hara, of his evil inclination, to rid himself, to shed himself of the poison and the venom that he has within him of this foreign god, and to let the existence and the power of God Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, to shine forth. So Abraham, the young man, accomplishes a tremendous innovation of intellect, and he begins the process of tikkun olam, of changing the world and bringing the world back to the clarity that it had prior. Abraham begins to disseminate his message. He goes on a mission. He goes from town to town and village to village, teaching, preaching, of course, debating with Abraham's arguments that he's right, that there exists an invisible, single, solitary creator to the world, and to whom we ought to give our fealty and our loyalty to. And of course, this begins the process of fixing the broken world. Now, Abraham, he's promoting or promulgating unpopular ideas, certainly unpopular by the people, the leadership of the time. Abraham faces death threats, he faces assassination attempts, but he forges ahead regardless and nonetheless. Abraham takes upon his shoulders the commitment to fulfill the mission of fixing the broken world. And from this commitment, right, the term chosen nation emerges. The term chosen nation is a little bit of a hot button topic, because what does it mean? Do we claim that we're better than everyone else? We're chosen, everyone else is not chosen. What are we chosen for? Who chose us? All those questions are answered when we examine the roots of this idea. Abraham is chosen in the Torah by God that his descendants will be the nation that gets the Torah, that is crucial to this era of Torah, the 2,000 years of Torah, and that ultimately is going to be at the vanguard of bringing the era of Messiah, of bringing tikkun olam, fixing the world, of bringing universal acceptance of the idea of God to the world. We're chosen for a mission. We're chosen the mission of tikkun olam, of fulfilling what Abraham began. And we're chosen, but we also have responsibility. We're chosen not because we're necessarily better, but because we, through Abraham, our forefather, accepted upon ourselves a commitment to do the vital job that the world needs. Now, Abraham personally is given 10 tests. 10 tests are, if you actually study them one by one, you'll notice that it's a gradual ascent in Abraham's character. And how does Abraham grow? Abraham grows by ridding himself, by eradicating the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination that's within. He, like all of us, is torn between, in this conflict of the foreign God that's within us, that the Yetzer Hara, this foreskin that Adam introduced to the world, and God. God's obscured. Abraham brought clarity and light to the world, ended the era of chaos by eradicating the foothold, the beachhead that his Yetzer Hara had over his consciousness. And by the way, if you notice, the one mitzvah that Abraham was given is the mitzvah of bris milah, of circumcision. Because Abraham earned it by actually fulfilling what it actually means. Abraham ridded himself of his Yetzer Hara, of the foreign God within him, to expose God to the world. And therefore, the man says, I'm going to give you the mitzvah of circumcision, which is symbolic of this, to remove the foreskin and to reveal the crown. Similarly, the mitzvah of circumcision is called a bris. A bris means a covenant, a treaty, a relationship, a bind. By removing the thing that unbinds us from God, Abraham reattaches, rebinds us with God. Now, we look at what Abraham was a man, and of course he met Sarah, and they became a team, and they developed followers, and they kick-started a movement that was actually very successful at its time. But we see again and again throughout history, certainly Jewish history, that big ideas, transformative innovations in history, they take a while to actually materialize. They start and they sputter, they start and they founder, they start and they flounder. It's never easy going. Any dramatic achievement, certainly on a national level, is not going to be easy. Abraham kickstarted his innovation, his insight, his dissemination, his fixing the world. He had a lot of initial success, but as we see throughout history, this is not going to be very smooth. So here's some examples. Those tens of thousands of followers that Abraham had and took with him, they're gone from history. We have no record of where they are, where they went. It seems like Abraham had a dramatic, meteoric ascent in this movement, but over time it fizzled out. Or it didn't necessarily fizzle out, but the amount of followers weren't necessarily as committed and didn't forge with the same tenacious effort that Abraham had. Not only that, Abraham's heir, right, is Isaac. But Isaac is not Abraham's first son. Abraham's first son is Ishmael. And Abraham's own kids didn't follow his path. We see that Ishmael, of course, is going to go on to his own, and he's going to be lacking severely in the Abrahamic ideals and principles. But ultimately, if you look at the big picture of Jewish history, we see that in about 2,000 years from where we're talking, maybe a little more, so about 2,200 years after Abraham, we meet the Muslims. And of course, the Muslims, they themselves, and we certainly do, we link them to Ishmael. And the Muslims have done tremendous work in disseminating the Abrahamic principle, the idea of one single solitary God that has dominion over all, and they proliferated that idea in the world. So in a weird, quirky way, Abraham's descendants, A, his primary descendant, who is Isaac and Isaac's line, B, his secondary descendant, which is Ishmael and Ishmael's line, they are both united in trying to fulfill the Abrahamic destiny. Now, Isaac was the spiritual heir of Abraham, but Isaac also had a son, Esau, that went awry. And, perhaps unwittingly, Esau is linked with, certainly in Jewish literature, with the Christians. And while the Christian idea of God is not quite the Jewish and Islamic idea of God, right? Islam and Judaism have a very close theologically. Christianity has some other tampering and tinkering with the core idea of what Abraham taught. But if you look at the world that Christianity emerged from, it's a world where the Roman historian Dio Cassius writes that the Romans had in excess of 30,000 gods. And to whittle that down to 3, or one and change, right, that's still dramatic. And in a weird way, Abraham's kind of other strands, Ishmael and Esau, also do a lot to bring about this final destiny at the end of the road for all of humanity. Now we find another pattern again. Abraham had kids that went awry, or a son. Isaac had a son that was not part of this centralized Jewish people. Jacob, third time's the charm. All of Jacob's kids comprise the tribes of the Jewish people. And in fact, this idea is not isolated in Jewish history. We find the Jewish people built a temple, right? Solomon built a temple, it was destroyed by the Babylonians, right? Ezra and Zerubbabel, they built a second temple, destroyed by the Romans, right? And in Judaism, we always talk about this third temple, that may be built speedily in our days, and we know that third temple, that's not going to get destroyed. The Jewish people, they move in to Israel and they establish the first commonwealth under Joshua. And of course, throughout history, the Assyrians and of course the Babylonians, they kick the Jews out. The Jews go into exile. They come back and they reestablish a commonwealth in Israel. And progressively over the history, the Greeks do their best to try to mitigate or to make their lives miserable. The Romans, of course, do what they do. And throughout history, progressively the Jewish people left Israel. And you know what? Now we're back. And we look at this as this is maybe a hop on topic, but the idea of the Jews coming back to Israel is foretold in the Torah. We tried it once, it didn't work. We tried it twice. Well, that failed as well. We hope that the third time's a charm for this as well. And a constant theme throughout Jewish history is that while we are focused on our mission of being the people of God, of being the people at the vanguard, of trying to bring Tikkun Olam, of bringing the world back to God, we're always going to be constantly contending with the non-Jews and with exile. So for example, even Abraham is told multiple times in the Torah, your kids will be the Jewish people, they'll be the nation that has Torah and has Israel and fulfills your mission that you began. But as a precondition, you have to be aware that this nation will go into exile. Right? The Almighty tells Abraham, you should know very well, this is from Genesis chapter 15, that your descendants will be foreigners in a land that's not theirs. They'll be enslaved. They'll be tormented for 400 years, but they will leave. And when they leave the nation that tormented them, I will judge, and they will leave with great wealth. What Abraham accepted, what our nation accepted, is not something easy. It's not all peaches and cream. There's going to be a lot of heartache along the way. There's going to be exile. There's going to be expulsion. There's going to be inquisition. There's going to be Holocaust. There's going to be blood libels. There's going to be a lot of stuff we're going to have to encounter. And that we have to know from the beginning. And the big question, one of the big questions that we have to ask is, why does it have to be so hard? Why can't it be easier? Why do we always have to be wandering from place to place, from exile to exile? So I want to give a few ideas here. That if we are going to fulfill our destiny of being God's representatives in the world, we need, and to influence the whole world, well, we need to have exposure to the whole world. If we live in our cocoon, if we're in a cave, if we're in Australia, away from everyone else, well, then how are we going to influence everyone else? And indeed, we know that despite the fact that the Jewish people are statistically insignificant, right? We're a very, very small percentage of the world's population, still we are at the forefront of the world's interest and the world's intrigue. And that is a function of our role. We have an outsized role in helping the world coming to perfection, in undoing what Adam began. And therefore, because we have such responsibility, right, we have to be central players on the world stage. Number two, we have to also be in exile because remember, we're going to be God's people. And we're going to be the people that change the world. And indeed, we see that we do change the world. You look at any innovation that happened or happening, or Nobel Prizes, or whatever measure of excellence you want to use, you find that the Jews are overrepresented in huge numbers. So what does that mean? It means because we have to create the super nation, so to speak. We have to create the nation that has all the qualities of all the nations. We have to integrate, assemble into our collective behavior, collective consciousness, into our collective midos, if you will, the positive characteristics of every single nation. So the Almighty says, okay, you're going to spend a couple hundred years here, a couple hundred years there, and in every place you have to draw from your host nation what is their qualities about that particular nation and try to assemble that into your own nation's characteristics. Now, our interactions with the non-Jews is heavily symbolized by the interactions that Jacob has with Esau. As we know, Jacob is the forefather that's called Israel, because Jacob becomes the final product of the Jewish people. Abraham has Ishmael, Isaac has Esau. Well, Jacob, all his kids are part of the Jewish people. Therefore, he's renamed Israel because Jacob fulfills the role of Jacob the individual, but also Israel as in the final forebearer of this nation. Now, right away from the beginning, Jacob is quarreling with Esau, even in utero, right? It's as if the Almighty says, you two are opposites, right? But you're twins, but you're together, right? You're in close confines. And if you read the Torah's description of the birth, we see that Esau emerges first. But what happens? Jacob comes out second, and he lunges forth and grabs the ankle of Esau. In fact, the name Yaakov, or Jacob, is from the Hebrew word akev, which means heel, because that's what happened. Jacob seizes the heel of Esau's older brother. Now, of course, that's a nice story, right? But of course, the Torah doesn't tell us just stories, it tells us lessons. And the lesson here is, one of the lessons is that Jacob, Israel's ultimate victory will not be a sure thing. if it's perhaps we could compare it to a race where Esau's got the head start. He's running ahead. And at the last minute, Jacob is going to catch up to him and emerge victorious. It's as if the nation, our mission, is not going to be assured at any point in history. If you pull out any year in history and say, what were the status of the Jewish people and what was the forecast? Give me the best case scenario. Project from any point in history, it would have been not necessarily so bright. It would have been very bleak and gloomy many times in history. And we know Esau emerges first. Esau has a huge head start, but Israel, Jacob, is going to win at the end. He's going to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. Not only that, Jacob, he marries Leah. He takes her for himself. Now, Jacob is a conflicted person. Jacob, we read about him, he's innocent. He's not complicated. He's called emes, he's called truth. He wants to sit in his tent to study Torah. But the Almighty is going to force him to become Israel. He's going to have to engage and outwit Esau. He's going to have to contend with his wily and deceitful father-in-law Laban, who's going to do all kinds of tricks on him. He's going to take his wife and say, no, not this wife, that wife. He's going to renege on agreements. He is going to change the terms of deals after they were finalized 100-fold. Jacob is put out of his comfort zone. Our nation, right? We may be a nation of the book, but we're put out of our comfort zone. Right? The Almighty is going to force us to grow and develop into a nation that's going to change the world, even though it may be very unnatural for us. Now, Jacob has a tormented life. If you read his story, Jacob has to escape. His brother wants to kill him. He escapes. When he comes back, he has to assume the role of a warrior. He has to manage a burgeoning family, very large family. There's multiple wives, and of course there's conflict between the wives, or at least there's friction, if you will. He has strong-minded and very challenging children. And if you look at any point in Jacob's history, you too would say that we can never be so sure that everything is going to be okay. For example, right, Reuven, his oldest son, right, it seems, if you read the story, that he commits a grievous blunder that is certainly unworthy of Jacob, the Jacob family, or certainly of the Abrahamic tribe that's going to, of course, become the Abrahamic religion, the Jewish people. Shimon and Levi, they appear to follow Esau's ideology. Esau was told, you live with your sword. They're upset at a city. They kill the whole city with sword. Yehuda, right? Yehuda, the next brother, the next one of Jacob's sons, he is demoted from his stature. And he has a very tumultuous and scandalous, if you will, family life. Joseph is taken away. Jacob's unsure what happens to him. It's as if you look at any point in time in Jacob's life, the family and certainly the dream of fulfilling the Abrahamic destiny seems to be falling out of his grasp. Of course, more troubles befall him. Right? He faces a famine. They have to go forage for food in Egypt. They send a contingency to Egypt, and the king of Egypt kidnaps Shimon. They come back and they say, okay, I got to bring Benjamin. He's losing everything. All his kids are just being taken from him, and he's not sure whether or not he will have anything to show for it once he's done his life. But ultimately, what happens? At the end of Jacob's lives, all his kids coalesce in Egypt. And of course, he gives blessings to each one of his kids. And we're told that each one of his kids were righteous. Each one of his kids was worthy to have their name etched upon a tribe of Israel for eternity. In fact, if you read the story of the end of Jacob's life, all the way at the end, right before he's about to die, it hit him. Everything fell into place. Everything made sense. Everything worked out in the end. And we're told, Ma'aseh avot siman labanim. What happens to the forefathers will happen to us. At any point in our history, we can be very doubtful, very dubious of the likelihood of success of our nation. Remember, our nation accepted upon itself a mission that is not an easy one. It's a mission that spans really the entire universe, the entire world. Who are we? We're a small nation. We're not so strong physically. We're constantly being ping-ponged back and forth from one nation to another nation. And at any point in time in our history, you would assume that the likelihood of success is very minimal. But we know that we will follow the same pattern of Israel, of Jacob, Whatever happened to him will happen to us. Only when all is said and done, only when the curtains are about to close, only then will we see how everything fell into place and everything was a resounding success. The book of Genesis ends with the death of Jacob and the death of all his sons. And what now? Jacob is dead. The last of the forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is dead. Jacob's sons are dead. And now, what began as a man became a family, became perhaps a movement for a short while, developed into a tribe. Now they started with 70 souls in Egypt, and now it's becoming a much bigger family. It's growing and growing. And of course, you open up the book of Exodus, and right away what happens? The Jewish people start proliferating. And there's huge numbers, and they seem very difficult to contain. And there's a tremendous development, right? Maybe end of Jacob's life ended on a high. The end of Genesis ended on a high. There was peace and unity amongst the family. There were high hopes for the future. That comes crashing down. Of course, it doesn't happen overnight, but progressively the Jewish people get enslaved both physically and spiritually. We're told they're enslaved physically. They have to work and work and work and work and work without being paid, without being treated with dignity, but also the attitudes of their forefathers, the attitude of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, began to fade from the collective memory of the people. They are also spiritually subjugated to the ideas of Pharaoh and to the way of life of the Egyptians. They, of course, forget the role and purpose and destiny. And in fact, if you look at what happens to them after a couple hundred years of Egypt, they lose hope. Moshe comes and says, I want to take you guys out of Egypt. And the people say, sorry, we cannot imagine a different kind of life. This is where we're going to be, and this is where we're going to stay, and this will always be here. They lose any ability to imagine themselves as anything other than slaves to Pharaoh. Once again, we see it looks like the nation will not fulfill their destiny. And when it's the bleakest, a very unusual leader is going to emerge and is going to save the Jewish people. Of course, we're talking about Moshe. Now, Moshe himself, his personality is a little bit unusual. Why? Because he does not exactly fit into the mold of the prototypical leader. Moshe, of course, if you read the beginning of Exodus, towards the end of the first parsha, end of Shmos, you'll see that the Almighty has to negotiate with him. Moses is refusing leadership. Certainly in our political environment, we can't imagine anyone refusing leadership, certainly not arguing with God that he's not worthy of leadership. Moshe is exceedingly humble. Moshe is so humble that Moshe tells God, not only am I not worthy to lead the Jewish people, but I'm the least worthy of everyone to lead the Jewish people. Not only that, Moshe has a speech impediment. You think of a great leader who's going to rally the troops and take them out of Egypt and inspire the nation as being someone who could give a resounding, speech and just enliven their spirits and compel them to change. Moshe had to speak through Aaron. Moshe had to have someone to speak for him because he would speak with a lisp. And the worst of all, the worst mark against Moshe's application or Moshe's credentials of leadership is the fact that Moshe grew up with Pharaoh. Moshe grew up in the heart of the enemy, in the lap of luxury. This is an elite. This is not someone who's a man of the people. Not only is he an elite, not a man of the people are suffering in slavery. And Moshe grew up in luxury. Not only that, but he grew up with the enemy. He grew up as a stepson to Pharaoh. Someone like that, if you had to overlook the Jewish people and say, who is most likely to be a leader that's going to save the Jewish people from their predicament, you would not think of Moshe. This guy doesn't have the skills, and certainly, how are they going to accept what he has to say? But as we see again and again in history, great Jewish leaders do not fit into a certain mold. You look at King David. King David, his own family, they said, David, he's not your guy. He's not the guy who's worthy of leadership. Of course, Rabbi Akiva was someone, a great transformative leader, much, much later in history. He was someone who was descendant from converts, someone who is a complete outsider, someone who was totally ignorant of Torah till a very advanced age in life, and he became the leader of the people of his day. And indeed, perhaps we could say that not only do great Jewish leaders not fit into a certain mold that you would have kind of imagined, but also salvation. The Jewish people, they're in the pits. It seems like it's curtains for the Jewish people. No one could have telegraphed how exactly the Jewish people would get out of this. Because the way the Almighty works is that the Almighty does not work with a great fanfare. If you try to say, I think I know how salvation is going to come, or who's going to be the next great Jewish leader, no, that's not the way the Almighty works. The Almighty has to take back alleys, so to speak, towards salvation. So, for example, the story of Judah and Tamar. Judah and Tamar is a story that if you read it, you start blushing because of the amount of shame of the scandal. His own daughter-in-law gets dressed up like a prostitute, and their kids are going to be the forebearers of Messiah. David and Bathsheba. A story that we can imagine actually happened, right? This is the way King Solomon, the Davidic line and the family of Messiah is going to be developed and propagated? And the answer is yes. The answer is the way the Almighty works in history is the Almighty does not take the main avenue. The Almighty takes the back avenues. That's how change actually happens. And I want to tell you guys on a personal note, if you want to change, the real change happens between you and the Almighty and you and yourself. You make big plasters of your resolutions. No, you try to make a big deal about it. There's not going to be any blessing found in such a endeavor. And by the way, I would say something maybe is a little controversial. But when we look at salvation in multiple eras in history, I think we could look at one in recent history, at least relatively recent history. I would venture to say that no one would have imagined that someone as distant from Judaism as Theodor Herzl, someone who a mere 7 years before the convention of the First Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897 wrote that he advocated the best way to solve the problem of anti-Semitism in Europe is mass conversion to Christianity. Someone like that is going to be instrumental to bring the Jewish people back to Israel. I don't think that's what the script we would have written. It doesn't make sense that salvation is going to find such a unusual messenger to bring about transformative change with the Jewish people, but that's how it happens. Now, Moshe is told by the Almighty to go save the Jewish people. We're told something very interesting about Moshe's travels to Israel, from Midian, where he was staying, to Egypt. This is from Exodus chapter 4. And Moshe took his wife and his kids, and he put them on top of a donkey. Now, the fact that Moshe took him on a donkey, not on a horse, not on a wagon, then in walk, is really not so significant to the story. And like we mentioned before, the Torah is not going out of its way to give us extraneous details that aren't relevant to the core story. Now that gets even a little bit more bizarre when you look at Rashi. Rashi quotes from the Talmud, that the Talmud says that this donkey that Moshe took with him and his family to Egypt is actually the same donkey that Abraham, 500 years prior, took with Isaac on the way to the binding of Isaac. And it gets even stranger. That same very donkey is the donkey that Messiah is going to ride on. Now, if you read that and you thought there's some sort of lesson about transportation, you clearly are not reading it with the way that the Torah wants us to understand. This is a tremendously deep and powerful insight into the three paramount figures of the history of the world. We started off by talking about three eras. The era of chaos where God's unknown. Comes along Abraham, and he changes that. He brings clarity. The era of Torah, where a nation is developed and grows internally to become a powerhouse of faith to change the world. Who is at the forefront of that? Who gave us the Torah? Who is the leader when we got the Torah? Of course, that's Moshe. That's Moses. It's even called Torah Moshe. And the last era is the era of Messiah, last 2,000 years. And who is going to be the leader at the end of that 2,000-year period that's going to put the final touches on this 2,000-year dissemination of the idea of God throughout the whole world? Of course, that's Messiah. So these three people are linked because they are the three people who are going to make these three transformations in these three eras. Now we're told these people are all riding on a donkey. Now, if you know a little bit about Jewish literature, you see that the term donkey appears multiple times. And even the word donkey in Hebrew, hamor, that word is closely etymologically to the word homer. Homer means physicality. And what this means is as follows. We started off with Adam. Adam introduced foreskin. Adam introduced Yetzer Hara, evil inclination. What Adam did is Adam empowered our internal donkey, so to speak, our physicality, our reframing the world as and people as being God-centric, focusing on God, to focusing on this physical world and this material world. That's what Adam did. We're told that this is going to be changed in stages. There's going to be 3 eras and 3 transformations. Abraham rode the donkey. What that means is that Abraham was able to harness and control his inner beast, his inner Yetzer Hara, so to speak. What Abraham did personally mirrored what Abraham did nationally and universally. Abraham personally got rid of the internal inhibitor to God, the Yetzer Hara, the foreign God within, the proverbial force, and he got rid of that. And now, who's in charge? Abraham's in charge. Abraham has the reins on his donkey. His physicality, he determines what happens, not the Yetzer Hara. Moshe brought about the second transformation, and he too rode the donkey. Of course, it doesn't mean that maybe he did ride a donkey, but is it the same donkey? Is there some sort of 3,800-year-old donkey that we have to find somewhere? Maybe, but that's not the lesson. The lesson is that how does change happen? How does Tikkun Olam happen? It happens by overcoming what we have within us. Abraham, Moses, Moshe, and Messiah, they are all pivotal figures in these 3 transformations because of what they did personally. And that reflected outwardly with how they changed the world. By the way, if you ask the question of Torah, there's a lot of mitzvahs in Torah. We say that the Torah is our toolbox, our manual for changing the world, for Tikkun Olam. You say, wait a minute. If I don't eat this food, I'm changing the world. What? Doesn't make sense. We don't have necessarily in our head, it doesn't link together. How does doing mitzvahs, how does following what the Torah instructs us to do, how does that bring about Messiah? How does that bring about fixing the world? Now we have the backstory. Any mitzvah that's telling us to do something or to refrain, to withhold from doing something, that is an act of empowerment of soul and of mitigation of Yetzer Hara. Anytime I say to my physicality, to my material self, to my inner Yetzer Hara, to my inner foreign God within, to my donkey that we all have within us, I say no, I am slowly climbing up his back, so to speak, that I'm going to be in charge. When I'm in charge, well, then the world is restored back to what Adam had prior to sin. God is known to the world because the inhibitor, the field of vision that was obscured by the Yetzer Hara, by the internal donkey within us, is removed. Of course, Moshe, under Moshe's leadership, the people that began as just Abraham and developed into a family, into a tribe, into a very large tribe, became a nation and became a religion. During this time period, of course, the Jewish people are not going to have a lot of interactions with the rest of the world. If you look at the Jewish people's impact in history, you almost find exactly at the point where the last 2,000 years begins, about the 2nd century of the Common Era, is when suddenly the Jewish ideas spread like wildfire in the world. The Jewish people were around for a long time. We have 1,300 years where the Jewish people are around and they're still making their trips around the world. They're still having interactions with other civilizations, but their ideas don't take root. And that's because during this interim era, the Jewish people, it's 2,000 years of Torah, which means working on developing a nation that is an absolute powerhouse of faith and Torah. After that, okay, suddenly, like almost overnight, the switch is turned on and the torrent of 2,000 years of Messiah, of changing the entire world, of making the ideas of the Abrahamic development and principles known to all, suddenly begins with great success. Back to Moses. So Moses gets this all started, right? Moshe is someone who was the leader of the people during the time of the Exodus, and of course, getting the Torah. And essentially, if you look at the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, once you start from Exodus chapter 2, Moshe is the critical character in the rest of the 5 books. And in fact, the 5 books actually ends with the death of Moshe. Now, the stories of Exodus are critical to our faith and religion. The miracles that happened, what did they do? They took a nation that was depressed, that had forgotten its roots, and it reconnected them to what Abraham had espoused many hundreds of years prior. The miracles, the revelations that happened, that deepened the nation's connection to God and to what they really stand for as a nation. If you look at the 10 plagues, they are almost a lesson, if you will, an entire curriculum of demonstration of God's dominion over all. Right? The first 3 are actually subterranean. God controls everything that happens below us. The next 3 are all above ground, but kind of at eye level. And the last 3, or the third 3, are all from the heavens. And that's trying to teach the nation that the Almighty has control over all. Don't say the Almighty has good control of things that are below, things that are at eye level, or things that are above. And lastly, of course, the ultimate, the Almighty has within his hand the power of life and death. That's a lesson for the Jewish people. Yes, of course, the Egyptians have to get punished. But the education here is for the Jewish people. They have to reconnect to what Abraham had taught, their forefather had taught many, many years ago. The Jewish people are surrounded. What happens? They start praying. What happens? The sea splits. This is another lesson they're told. Abraham developed prayer. Isaac developed prayer. Jacob developed prayer. We know Abraham taught us Shacharis, morning prayer. Isaac developed the afternoon prayer, and Jacob the evening prayer. Right? We're reconnecting with our foundations, with our beginnings. And the Almighty loves us and responds to our prayers. Now, 50 days after the Jewish people leave Egypt, the most significant event in all of human history happens. Of course, that's the Mount Sinai experience. This is the foundational event that is going to begin, kickstart our religion. And it is an event that is unparalleled in all of human history. This is an event where the entire nation, men, women, and children, experienced prophecy, had absolute clarity, and God spoke to them. When you watch the movies, right, they don't actually say what the book says. It's always better to read the book, right? You learned that in 5th grade. Read the book, don't watch the movies, right? Read the way it's described in the book of Exodus, chapter 19 and 20, and when it's repeated in the beginning of the book of Deuteronomy. It says very clearly, the Almighty tells the Jewish people, it wasn't hearsay. You saw it with your own eyes. You heard with your own ears. You experienced prophecy together with Moses at the foot of the mountain 50 days after leaving Egypt. What this does is it eradicates any doubts the Jewish people may have had prior, and it proves that Moshe is a legitimate prophet because they experienced prophecy in tandem with Moshe. They see Moshe going up to the heaven. He spends 40 days and 40 nights there, not eating and not drinking. He comes back, he goes back up. He ends up going for a total of 3 times, 120 days straight of not eating and not drinking, up in the heavens. And now, whatever Moshe tells us, we know it comes from God. Moshe has been validated as a true prophet. Thus, when we study Torah from Moshe, Moshe is telling us, this I got from God. Well, we know he actually has the goods, because we know, we've experienced, we as in the nation, a nation of millions, have experienced prophecy alongside Moshe. We know he's the real deal, and thus when he says it's the word of the prophet. And that, by the way, Moshe is called the father of all prophets. You know why he's called the father of prophets? He's called the father of prophets because all prophets are his descendants. The only reason why we believe Abraham was a prophet, we have no evidence to that, but when Moshe tells us that Abraham is or was a prophet, then we trust Moshe because Moshe is a verified prophet, and thus all other prophets can be validated with his word. Similarly, all future prophets, Moshe outlines the process of what someone needs to do to become a prophet. Thus, if someone fulfills all the requirements of prophecy that Moshe laid out many years prior, we can validate them based upon what Moshe told us earlier. And thus all prophets, those that existed before Moshe, those that came after Moshe, they are all essentially descendants of Moshe in prophecy, because we only believe their prophecy because of what Moshe told us. And Moshe was a validated prophet, because we all experienced prophecy alongside him at Mount Sinai. Now, Mount Sinai experience is the beginning of 40 years. If you read from the middle of Exodus all the way to the end of the Torah, that is a description of the Jewish people, the Jewish nation or in the wilderness, in various places along the wilderness, after Sinai, after they got the Torah. What were they doing all the time? So read the Torah. Vayomer Hashem Moshe Lemar. The Almighty told Moshe to say, right? Teach the Jewish people Torah. This is 40 years. This generation is called the Dor Dea, the nation, the generation of knowledge, because that's what they did all day and all night. In fact, even at Mount Sinai, they spent an entire year at the mountain. What were they doing? They were studying Torah. Moshe was teaching them from the Almighty. The Almighty teaches Moshe. Moshe teaches the nation. How did Moshe teach the nation? We spoke about it previously. Moshe teaches Aaron. Moshe teaches Joshua. Moshe teaches Aaron's kids. Eventually, the whole nation files in, and then they discuss amongst each other. Now, during these 40 years, the nation flourished and grew. However, does not mean there was no hiccups. As always in Jewish history, some things are wonderful and they happen at tremendous meteoric speed, but of course, there's always going to be something that's going to trip us up along the way. During the 40 years, we grew tremendously. Things were wonderful, but of course, the Jewish people sinned the golden calf. There were various complaints. The people say, "Give us meat. We don't like the manna. It doesn't taste good. We want to go back to Egypt." Of course, there was the disaster of the spies when the people essentially rejected the Almighty's pledge that the land of Israel is good and I'll help you conquer it. And there was rebellions, various rebellions. Most famously, of course, is the Korach rebellion, where Korach questioned the legitimacy of Moshe's leadership. But aside from those stories, which are all documented in the Torah because of the lessons they contain for us and future generations, the people had tremendous 40 years of Torah study. Moshe was teaching, people were studying. In fact, by the way, just as a quick side note, one of the criticisms that generation gets is the fact that when they got the instruction, we're finally leaving Mount Sinai after a year of being encamped at the foot of the mountain, the people were delighted. They were excited. Finally, we get to leave school, basically. And we're told this was a devastation because the people, what do you mean? You're getting Torah from God via Moses? This is the greatest experience it could possibly be. You should be devastated that you're leaving. But there was an element of relief that we finally get Ketina Kabarechu Meita Sefer, the Talmud tells us. Like a child who is running away from school, like the bell rings, we're out, we're delighted. That was part of the criticism of the nation. There was so much Torah. They were so engorged. They were so immersed in Torah study that there was a certain sense of relief when they got a little break. Now, if you look at the way of life of the people throughout these 40 years, it was really a supernatural status. They have morning, they all went out to collect this magical manna that fell from heaven, right? That's what they ate. Who ate that? Everyone. A nation of millions ate that for 40 years. Manna tastes like whatever you want it, like whatever you want it to taste like. Pretty remarkable. How did they drink water? Well, there was a huge rock, and the rock was like a river. It would just have water emanating from a rock. Where did they go to buy clothing? There's no malls, right? In the Transjordan or Sinai Desert, there's no malls. What they do? Well, the clothing grew with them. This is all, by the way, verses in the Torah. It's not you don't need to rely on any tradition. Not only that, they were surrounded by day with a topography flattening cloud, which means wherever they went, there was no war, no concerns about having to climb mountains or to descend down rocky valleys. The cloud was a magical cloud. It would flatten their way. It would flatten everything in their way. At night, there was a miraculous pillar of fire that is protecting them. And of course, at the head of this nation at that time is Moshe. And Moshe, one of the greatest human of all time. He's there. People are meeting him, talking to him, and he's in direct communication with God. That is a nation that is living in a supernatural status. When we get to the next phase in Jewish history, we're going to see what happens when the Jewish people get to Israel. When they get to Israel, there's no more manna. How do you eat? You have farmers. You got to plant. You got to do it the old-fashioned way, right? There's water. You got to go to the well. You got to find the water, right? Joshua's great, but he's not Moshe. The clothing. What do you got to do? You got to start sewing, right? And you don't have no clouds. Like many of the miracles go away. And the great challenge the people are going to face once they get into the land of Israel is that, okay, Can we still be great? Can we still change the world? Can we still be connected to Torah and to our mission, despite the fact that we're not living in the supernatural way of life? It's almost as if you have kids, right? The kids don't worry about who's going to pay the bills, who's going to pay the electricity bills, who's going to fill the car with gas, right? Parents take care of that. They just need to grow and develop and flourish and study. That's what the Almighty did for us. During this embryonic stage of our nation, we have to grow and develop and study. We're little babies, right? The Almighty says, I'll take care of everything. Your food, your drink, your water, everything. And when the Almighty takes care of it, it's pretty awesome. It's pretty awesome. Now, Moshe dies, of course, on the doorstep of Israel. If we are to look actually at the Torah from the beginning to end, holistically, we find a very interesting pattern that really mirrors the central theme of tonight's discussion. In Jewish literature, we're told that a person, a human, is called olam katan, which means a small world. Now, just like our big world, we demonstrated that it's a broken world that needs fixing. The small world also needs fixing. And just like the big world does not recognize the dominion and power of God, so too the small world shares that same malady. It too does not recognize the dominion and control of God. Now, let's look at it from beginning to end. The Torah begins with Adam and ends with Moshe. It begins with Adam. Adam, of course, integrated the Yetzer Hara into him. Adam, on his own, chose to have the Yetzer Hara, to have the foreign God within him. And that, of course, broke the world. Adam introduced the foreign God that obscured God. And that's the beginning of the Torah. Now, what is Moshe representative of? Moshe represents a world, a small world, albeit a human, that's entirely fixed, entirely complete. Moshe was able to restore his soul back to the status of Adam before Adam sinned. It's almost as if you have a snapshot of the big picture of human history. Just like in the big picture of human history, we have a broken world because the world doesn't recognize God. And our goal, our nation's goal, the Abrahamic destiny is that the Jewish nation is going to be the ones that restore the world to its perfection, where God is known to all. In the small world that begins with Adam, Adam broke his own world, right? He introduced the proverbial foreskin that obscured God from his world. And what did Moshe do? Moshe ridded himself, eradicated his Yetzer Hara within him, where when you look at Moshe at the end of his life, what was he comprised of? He looked exactly like Adam did before Adam sinned. So for example, Moshe spends 120 days without eating or drinking. How is it possible to live without eating or drinking? The answer is that yes, if you're a body, if you're oriented in the physical material world, like all of us are, you have to feed the beast, so to speak. You got to feed that donkey, right? But if you're riding the donkey, if you're separated from the donkey, well, the soul doesn't need physical food. The soul is unhindered now. Moshe's soul is unhindered. He can go on his way days without eating or drinking. Not only that, we're told that Moshe Rabbeinu's prophecy was different than the rest of the prophets in several material ways. Number one, Moshe was able to communicate directly with God, not via any proxies. Moshe was able to communicate during the day, not at night. The rest of the prophets are at night. Moshe had direct communication in the form of oral instruction, as opposed to the rest of the prophets that they got imagery that they had to interpret. Moshe was able to summon prophecy whenever he chose, and by the way, the Talmud tells us that Moshe was also able to time travel. Now, all those things are not possible so long as we have the Yetzer Hara within us. If we are linked to this physical world, if we identify with our body instead of our soul, well, then we have the limitations of the body. Our body can't talk to God. It can't. Our soul can. Our body can't. If we make ourselves soulful, if we remove this proverbial foreskin, if we remove this donkey, if we get rid of this foreign God within us, well, then we too will be able to have prophecy. If we do it entirely like Moshe did, well, then no limitations that are placed upon our physical orientation are going to hinder us from achieving whatever it is our soul can potentially achieve. Indeed, we could look at the Torah from beginning to end as a microcosm of Jewish history. The Torah starts off with chaos, and of course, we have Torah in the middle, and Moshe, as an individual, as a small world, achieved the idea of Messiah, of universality, where the knowledge of God permeated his little world in the way that we hope our nation can bring to the world at large. The Torah, of course, ends with the death of Moshe, the greatest human that has ever lived, the greatest leader of all time, is no longer there to lead the Jewish people. How will the Jews fare in his absence? I look forward to seeing you guys next week. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. So, was that the same donkey Balaam was on?
Oh, so Bilam. What about Bilam's donkey? Good question. Because Bilam actually,
about that too.
what did Bilam do with his donkey? Do you know?
He told it to go.
He talked it.
Yeah.
Correct? Torah says that he talked his donkey.
Well, the donkey talked to him.
And he had a conversation with his donkey, right?
Yeah.
Huh?
Wasn't the donkey an
Well,
angel?
I don't
the
know,
donkey saw
but
the angel.
It's a very interesting question that you asked. And the answer is because Bilam, he wasn't riding his donkey. He wasn't above his donkey. He actually had a conversation. Right? It was a bilateral relation. It was they were on the same terms, so to speak. And by the way, the Talmud also says that Bilam had a carnal relationship with his donkey. And of course, that seems that it was very intimate. It wasn't that Bilam was superior to his donkey. Now, I will grant you that Bilam had the potential to be like Moshe. He had a donkey. He could have ridden it, but he opted to be on the same level with it to kind of immerse himself in it. Any other questions?
Yeah, I got a question.
Go ahead, Dave.
You stated that Esau was destined to marry Leah,
Yes.
but didn't Leah trick? Wasn't Rachel supposed to marry Jacob?
Rachel was supposed to marry Jacob, and because they were both the younger siblings. Right. Leah was supposed to marry Esau. That's why, by the way, the Torah describes that Leah was always crying because she didn't want to marry Esau. But in a certain sense, that made sense. That relationship, and of course, Jacob comes and he takes it like he takes everything else that Esau has. Okay, everyone. I look forward to seeing you guys next week. What happens when the Jewish people don't have Moshe to